All right, welcome to the Praxis Behind the Obscure podcast. And today I have a very special guest. I have Greg Kaminsky, who I recently heard on the Glitch Bottle podcast. Big shout out to that podcast. Pretty sure everybody who listens to this probably knows about that one. So, I would like you to introduce yourself for people who don't know about you and sort of how you initially got into the Western esoteric tradition and occultism in general. And then maybe a little bit about how you've been diving into Vajrayana Buddhism for the past, quite a while, I believe.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Greg Kaminsky. I have been interested in the occult and esoteric, I don't know, for probably a little over 20 years, maybe 25. I don't know. At that point, it kind of lose track. It's been a while. And at some point along, I've always been interested in it, even from like as a child, not even knowing what it was that I was interested in.
Mm-hmm.
You could give it many names, but ultimately it's some kind of longing to understand the mystery of existence. And that longing just grew and grew and grew as I got older. And somewhere along the way, I started doing the Occult of Personality podcast, and really enjoying exploring all of the subtleties and nuances and histories and personalities involved in Western esoteric traditions. Just exploring tarot and alchemy and Kabbalah and ceremonial magic and Freemasonry, and seeing the connections between all of these things, and at some level what they were aiming towards, at least ostensibly, which is, to me, this idea of Gnosis, which, it's not just an idea, but it is mostly conceptual at this point. And so that's really kind of my trajectory, I guess you could say, is kind of exploring these topics, these subjects, these arts and traditions from both an outsider perspective in terms of like studying it academically, as well as like an insider perspective in terms of being a practitioner. And I think that it's been quite a journey, I guess. There's a lot more I could say about it. Aside from Occult of Personality podcast, I also have another website podcast, Chamber of Reflection, which is a lot of like continuations of the podcast interviews for Occult of Personality, but it also features a lot of unique presentations and discussions and conversations and research papers and whatnot. So it's a bit more diverse, but it's definitely more in depth for more serious spiritual aspirants, I guess you could say. And I don't know, and my life has kind of taken on a similar trajectory in terms of, I don't know, anything you could call a career, which I don't, but like my days consist mainly of reading and writing spiritual books, websites, podcasts, just doing spiritual practice, getting some teachings if I'm lucky, and just focusing on the same things I've been focusing on for a while, but just with more structure and more guidance, I guess you could say at this point.
Okay, cool. From the previous podcast I heard you on, it sounded like you were more focused on the Vajrayana path with the practices and fully absorbing into the worldview. So you mentioned that you're writing a lot of material and doing practices. Is this like a mix of Eastern and Western practices, or are you primarily focused on the Vajrayana path? How's your current practice and your current writings look?
Yeah, I mean, I'm focused on the Vajrayana path, but I mean, also, like, I think there's dimensions of my contemplations and sometimes practices that are not completely Vajrayana, like, I guess one example would be like doing like Gurdjieff style practice of like self-remembering, or like contemplating teachings of like Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, or like Christian mystics. So it's mostly Vajrayana in terms of the methods and the practice and the view, certainly, but it's not like totally one-dimensional either. And I think my writings is really mostly focused on the same sort of thing as I've been focusing on with the PRONAOS book, which is Nongdro, these pre-preliminary practices of Buddhist Tantra. But I'm also finishing up a book with Anathema Publishing that's going to be coming out in the near future that has to deal with Renaissance philosopher Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and his Christian Kabbalah and angelology. And so I don't know, I kind of still keep my foot in the Western esoteric waters, and I always will, because I have a very strong connection to all of that. And I still, do tarot readings and study the symbolism. And so it's not, I don't know, it's just every person's unique, and I've had like a kind of a winding path, you could say.
Oh, definitely. I think I share similar sentiments, kind of having feet in both worlds. It's all part of the human experience, so to speak. But at the same time, there are some key differences in perhaps worldview of different traditions, right? And so maybe you can share a little bit about what worldview, or what's the difference in the worldview and praxis of the Vajrayana practices as opposed to, or in comparison with, like the Western occult tradition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I know what the view of Vajrayana is, because it's articulated and fairly clear, even if it's not completely understandable. See, I could say it right now. The view is reality is simply the divine coming to know itself. And, you can elaborate on that, but that's like the essence of it. In terms of Western esoteric traditions, I mean, I think it really depends on which specific tradition you're talking about, because Christian Kabbalism is going to have a different view than Jewish Kabbalism to some extent, simply because they're different faith traditions. I don't know. I feel like this is a difficult point, because if Western traditions more fully considered and articulated their view of reality, then they would be more discriminating and discerning in terms of the methods that are employed to make that view real, or to realize it. but they don't. And that's an issue. And this is the same, this is no different than the issue of no living masters. I mean, you might find some in Jewish Kabbalism or Islamic Sufism or in certain Christian esoteric schools, but not in Freemasonry, or not, you know, a world-renowned tarot creator and reader, and not in ceremonial magic, unfortunately. But also these traditions, they're, I don't know, one of their goals might be Gnosis, but it certainly doesn't seem to be the primary goal. So I think that, to me, that's the real difference between spiritual paths is, and it's not an Eastern or Western difference. It's just a difference between traditions that exalt wisdom, meaning Gnosis is the primary and really only goal, and they have a living master that teaches the students, because seemingly that's the only way to really make it work. And even then it's barely workable. So to me, that's really the essence of what the differences are. I mean, I love Western esoteric traditions, and I still do, but I'm not really under the illusion that I'm going to encounter wisdom there, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think what's unique about Vajrayana in my exploration so far is it's a very clear roadmap, like very clear practices. I mean, there are, of course, it is esoteric and there are things to juggle, and it's not like 100% easy to understand or anything like that, but there is a clear set of instructions and a clear roadmap. Whereas sometimes in the Western esoteric tradition, in certain traditions, there might be a similar striving towards gnosis or worldview, but I feel like it's a hodgepodge of like mixed instructions that leave people confused because the terminology isn't necessarily the terminology can be easily confused, and it's not as clear cut, I guess you would say. So it doesn't, maybe the goal is perhaps gnosis, but it sort of leaves people confused more than, you know, on track, I guess you would say. At least that's what I've seen and experienced to a degree. But
I mean, I don't know. I don't believe, and I've never experienced anyone who's attained gnosis from reading a book or doing a ritual. It's always been under the guidance of someone who already has done it and is a teacher. And those are not the same thing. I mean, enlightened teacher, like, because you could have someone who's attained gnosis but doesn't know how to teach another to do it, and so where are you then? Like, you're nowhere. So
maybe you can share a little bit. Oh, sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, no, it's all right. I think that's, to me, that's really the most fundamental point. It's not so much that the words can be misconstrued or lead people astray. It's that it's impossible to actually understand it unless you have someone sitting in front of you who is living it and can explain it to you. And that's not just like one time, because we're human, and you know, we're going to need like repeated different ways, and to ask questions and to test it, and really to understand it over time. And it's just not possible to do that without a living teacher. I wish it were. I mean, it'd be much easier. But that's not the case, as I've come to learn.
Okay, maybe you can share a little bit about, because you're talking about having a living master, or living teacher, and that implies, of course, that you have one, right? And so maybe you can share a little bit about how you found your teacher and the relationship between you and your teacher.
Yeah, so I had interviewed a guy named David Hyam Smith, who's also been interviewed on Glitch Bottle a few times. And he was always talking about this non-emanationist view, this like Kabbalah that was non-emanationist and like non-theistic, and it sounded really weird to me. But what he was saying were things that were very similar to what I had read in I Am That talks with Nisargadatta Maharaj, where he's basically talking to people who come to visit him and trying to speak to them from the state of Gnosis, essentially. And so the fact that David was speaking to me like that, I was like, something, this is, I don't know where he's getting this, but this is not like what it seems to be. And so I like kind of asked him about his teacher and like what the situation was, and he basically, like, I don't know what you'd call it, kind of put me off and just was like, oh, he doesn't accept students, and you know, I can't even tell you who he is or anything. So I just kind of accepted that for many years. And then eventually I had Lyme disease and got sick. And at one point I was complaining about it to him, and he said, well, maybe now's a good time for you to come meet my teacher. And I was like, this had been like 9 years at this point. So
wow.
Yeah. So I waited a while, and then when I finally met him, I pretty much knew immediately, because he was saying all the things that I'd like been intuiting but didn't really understand, but he could also explain like the nature of reality in a way that I could actually understand it. And to me, that was like completely mind-blowing, and still is to this day, because it's like a level of understanding that's completely sublime, and I couldn't even begin to express like exactly how much it has affected me. So, you know, it's like a kind of at that level. But I mean, if you encounter someone like that, you know it, and it's pretty obvious, and it kind of settles all questions.
Right. Was it basically just off the first meeting, the first impression, you were sort of immediately like, oh, this is it? It was like an intuitive sense that this is somebody that I need to study under.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, at that point, I've talked to hundreds of teachers, and not just esoteric teachers. I mean, teachers in academia, and you know, all sorts of mentor figures, you know, in the religious domain. So I had a sense of what most of those people had to offer, and this was entirely different.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, one key concept. So we were talking a little bit about non-dual awareness and non-emanationism, and one key concept in Buddhism in general is the concept of shunyata, or emptiness, right? And so, can you share a little bit about it's almost this non-conceptuality, right? Like, what is shunyata? What is this emptiness they're talking about, and what does that imply in one's worldview and practice?
Well, emptiness could be also understood as openness or no thingness. So, I mean, this is, I think, certainly a sort of a non-experience in meditation if one reaches a certain point where you kind of get pulled into this nothingness state where there's no you or me or God, and there's no time nor space or anything really at all. There's no things. And this is also, I think, the origin of what is termed Apathetic Theology, or the via negativa,
Mhm.
you know, where the divine is unknowable and inconceivable and ineffable. And this emptiness is really, you know, also related to the interdependence of all phenomena
Mhm.
in regards to the fact that nothing is independently existing on its own. It doesn't arise as itself, and that can be understood intellectually, but it can also be understood in meditation, in this nothingness state. So, I mean, it sounds simple, but this openness or this nothingness is also completely full of all potential, because all appearance arises from it. So it's like that saying about it's the emptiness at the heart of the bead that allows you to string them together to form the mala.
Mhm.
So it's the emptiness of reality, this no thingness, that allows all appearance to arise in its myriad forms and all its beauty and horror.
I think the overall concept of shunyata, or emptiness, is sort of a mind-blowing. It's hard to deal with, I guess you would say, right, for a lot of people. And it's like you're conceptualizing the non-conceptual. I think that's what a lot of people get kind of stuck on as well, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, on some level, you know, that is the nature of mind, is
Mhm.
emptiness, or this openness. And I think it is troubling because on some level we intuit, even if we don't fully confront it,
Mhm.
that the reality of emptiness means that there is no you. Like the you that we conceive of, the self, is completely conceptual, is not real in any way. And what we think of as our body was never ours to begin with.
Mhm.
And so kind of confronting this is like, well, then who am I? Which is exactly the right question, because you're nobody at all.
Right, 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 right. There is no ultimate self that is, you know, uh, inherent of existence, that's not dependent on everything else. So yeah, the ultimate concept, I think that concept alone sort of runs opposed to a lot of theology or worldviews in general, right? And that it's kind of a big game changer, I would say,
Well,
for sure.
I mean, I would not say that it runs counter to most.
Mhm.
I would say it actually runs congruent to almost every esoteric tradition that I've looked at that's like really serious, you know, because
Okay.
if you look at like Meister Eckhart,
Mhm.
like he was expressing, like, I can't know God, but I can be God, or
Mhm.
that the same eye that God sees me is the same eye that I see God. You know, it's one eye and one heart and one love. I mean, he's expressing this same exact non-dual realization of emptiness and nothingness. Same with like Marguerite Porete, and she said, my true nature is nothingness, right? And she's expressing this sort of Gnostic viewpoint of I am no thing. There are no things. It's all just the divine coming to know itself. So this sort of view and this realization of nothingness has also been at the heart of many, if not all, like true, authentic spiritual traditions that exalt wisdom, because the nothingness is where the thingness arises from. I mean, ultimately, we're denying thingness altogether, but these are very subtle points. And the important part here that I think, to me, is that, a lot of great spiritual masters have expressed this exact idea. Rebbe Nachman talked about this idea of self-nullification, which is the same exact thing as the realization of emptiness or nothingness. So, I mean, I think it's wonderful, but it's also, I can understand why people wouldn't want to embrace it, because it really means the end of any kind of specialness or individuality in a way that can be cultivated, and like self-centered thought can like revolve around. It completely obliterates that.
Yeah, definitely terrifying for the ego, right?
Yeah, well, it makes the ego see that egoing is an activity that is a habit, and that's all it's doing. There's not even an ego.
Yeah, it's very powerful, very strong. Okay, you mentioned that you met your teacher, your master. However, there are practices. You talk a lot about. I don't know how to exactly pronounce. Is it Nundro? Is that how you say the preliminary practices?
Yeah, Nundro. Yeah.
Nundro. Okay, because it's spelled with the NG. So
Yeah, those Tibetan transliterations are pretty wild.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I'm actually fluent in Korean, and so every time it's funny because if I read things in Korean, I know exactly how to say them, right? But what's funny is when I see them written in English, I don't know what it's like. I don't know how to pronounce this because I'm not sure what what letter they mean when they use certain, combinations and what have you. But it's kind of a similar thing. But anyways, yeah, you mentioned a lot about Nundro and the preliminary practices. Are these something that one can start to do on their own, or would you say that
Oh
you
no.
need a teacher or
Yeah.
initiation? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you need a teacher and the initiation, both.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But that's not impossible. I mean, it is, if one were suited to it and authentically wanted and was prepared to do it, then it would be possible to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay.
But yeah, you can't just start doing it yourself and expect that, number one, you would actually be able to accomplish it. And number two, even if you were able to physically perform the practices that you wouldn't get any benefit from it, because you don't have the blessing from the lineage holder who has not only accomplished the practice, but holds the sort of the key to transmitting the empowerment that would allow your subtle body to be affected by the practice in the way that it's supposed to be.
Um, what are some of these key practices? Maybe you can share with the listeners what are some of the key practices of Nundro in general?
there's four major practices that include refuge, purification, mandala offerings, and guru yoga. The refuge practice consists primarily of refuge prayer and performing physical prostrations. And then the purification involves the deity Vajrasattva, who is the deity of purification, and you do visualization and repeat his mantra. And then the mandala offering is basically prayers and using a mandala tray and colored rice to make offerings of basically everything. And then the Guru Yoga is a 6-day retreat with a specific set of visualizations and mantras and additional practices that allows the practitioner to basically what we would call a tongue tip taste of the enlightened state, if just for a moment or two. And the repetitions for all of these practices is 111,111. And ideally, it should be done in less than 3 years. I mean, actually, that's like the minimum. But ideally, if you could do it on retreat, in less than a year, maybe that would be the ideal. But that's a different sort of person than you or I probably are.
Right. Yeah, I know a lot of schools. They say to do it 111,111 of all of these, right, including the prostrations, the Vajrasattva,
The mandala.
So, the mandala for you personally, and the Guru Yoga, yes. For you personally, you went through all of these practices, is that right?
That's right.
How long did it take you as a Westerner, not a Tibetan, living in a monastery,
Yeah, it was 2 years, but I was practicing like during the day, and I was doing it as much as I was able to.
Okay.
And it still took me a long time. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And I had to start over actually at one point.
Why is that?
Well, when I started the Nongdro, I was living in Massachusetts, and I wasn't making much progress. And then I moved to Michigan to be closer to my teacher. And then I really had to start over because the rate that I was going, it wasn't really working well. Like you really have to do a significant amount of practice every day to really get the benefit from it.
Okay, so people who are interested in these sort of practices, as you mentioned, it's very important to have a teacher, a lineage guru. For somebody who's really interested, how can they seek out a teacher or somebody in one of these traditions?
Yeah, that's a tough one because I kind of stumbled on my teacher, and he is the right teacher for me. And he's the right teacher for some other people too, but he's not the right teacher for everyone. And I can't really tell you how to go about finding an enlightened master. I was barely able to do it myself, and I don't really know how it happened. If I look at it from my perspective, it was like dumb luck. So I might not be the best person to ask. What I can tell you though, and this I'm fairly certain of, you know that saying, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear?
Yes.
That's not true. That's a bunch of crap. But what is true is that when the student is ready, they will know how to find the teacher.
Okay. Yeah, I
So
like that.
that I know for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I like that take on it for sure. That's a good one.
That's not even mine. That's my teacher's. So I'm like
Okay.
I'm ripping it off from him. But I don't really, everything I'm saying is his like teaching. So
Mm-hmm.
none of this is my material, right? All of this
Right.
is things I've been taught. And so it's important to recognize that.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Um,
So you
yeah.
don't think that I have any wisdom or understanding. So you don't need to bother me.
That's pretty funny. Yeah. And these practices, like the teacher that I've connected with, they do always point back to the masters, Padmasambhava, Milarepa, the whole lineage as bringing through the blessings. It's not of their own, so to speak, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you could even conceive of the tremendous sacrifice and heroic nature of the practices that these, that Guru Rinpoche or Padmasambhava
Mm-hmm.
accomplished, uh, it's only through his blessings and grace that any of this is even possible.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, we pray to Guru Rinpoche and do Guru Mantra, and we know that he hears it and responds and answers prayers. So, yeah, that's definitely a crucial aspect, not only of Vajrayana, but any true, authentic spiritual path or tradition has a lineage, and the lineage holders are they embody that tradition. That's where it resides, and that's how it comes about. So it's very important.
Mm-hmm. Oh, most definitely. Um, in general, in Tibetan Buddhism, there are some shamanistic or sort of magical practices, I believe, right? Have you come across any of this? These sort of like
Oh,
because
oh yeah,
previously there was like the bone tradition, right?
yeah.
And so do these sort of magical practices or shamanistic practices play a role in Vajrayana?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
Without a
Okay.
doubt. I
Hmm.
don't think you could practice Vajrayana without magical acts and protection and
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, it's like every kind of magic you can encounter is employed.
Mhm. For sure, for sure. That's been my experience so far as well, compared to here in Korea, most of the Buddhist schools, in fact, I think over 90% are Zen. And in contrast with Vajrayana, it's, quite different in practice, right? Because Zen really focuses on Zazen or sort of like Vipassana, sitting still, whereas that and breathing, right? Whereas, of course, that's important in Vajrayana as well, but there are a wide array of practices and technologies that I can only really describe as like magical or tantric, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you really get into it, like the primary practices of Vajrayana are the generation phase deity yoga,
Hmm.
and then the completion phase yogas.
Hmm. Hmm.
But the generation phase deity yoga is really the primary thing that most practitioners are doing, and that involves visualization of a deity
Hmm.
that may or could be simple or complex depending on the practice, and then repetition of the deity's mantra, and then that's like enclosed within a sadhana practice, and that has various aspects to it, but that's really like the primary thing. So in within the generation phase deity yoga,
Hmm.
the as you get into the actual technicality of the practice, you have this thing called the Three Samadhis. And these are three sort of stages of the deity arising, or what would be visualizing the deity when you're starting out.
Mm-hmm.
And in these three moments, if you will, they correspond with moments in the sadhana of the visualizations. They correspond with states of being in terms of one's meditative accomplishment and level of awareness. And it also corresponds to, a moment of death, the bardo, and then moment of rebirth, in terms of purifying those for, that when that actually happens. Because,
Right. Mm-hmm.
that's what you're ultimately practicing for, is those moments. So you can recognize what arises is no more real than anything else. It's not actually real at all. It's just because what happens, according to what I've been taught, is like when the luminosity arises from the openness, nothingness. This is the same emptiness we were talking about earlier.
Right.
This luminosity arises, and it can go one of two ways. The way it usually goes is we perceive ourselves to be a subject in a world of objects,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's what we are. But it can also go another way, which is a sort of recognition of the appearance and the perception of it are not two. They're the
Mm-hmm.
same. And that there's no subject or object. It's all one or none, as the case may be.
Right.
So, yeah, it can go two ways. It usually goes, subject object, but it doesn't have to.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can go the other way at those crucial moments of death or bardo, in between, or the rebirth, we have the capacity to it in some way transcend that. But this is all kind of difficult for one who doesn't remember it or can't imagine it. And so, we
Oops, you cut out. Uh, can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, you just cut out for probably about 10 seconds. It's okay. It's okay.
All right.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's what's quite interesting about Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhism, is that a lot of these practices are aimed or sort of focused on the dying process, right? So you have like dream yoga, you have these emptiness or dissolution of elements meditations, and there are a whole array of practices that are almost aimed at achieving enlightenment, or holding on to the clear light, basically, right, during these different phases of death. And they use the sleep process, the meditation process. It takes a variety of approaches to sort of stabilize this awareness, either in this
Yeah, well, I mean,
lifetime.
they use every approach. I
Right,
think
right.
that's part of, like, that's why Gurdjieff called it the fourth way, because it's not this
Mhm.
way or that way or the other way. It's all of them at once.
Right. Right.
And that's how Vajrayana is. It doesn't just do the way of the yogi or the way of the jnani or the
Mm-hmm.
way of the bhakti. It does all of them all at once.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Right.
that's what the sadhana is.
Mm-hmm.
It's an opportunity to do the devotional, to do the contemplative, and then to do the yogic. And by yogic, I'm talking about like the visualization and the technical aspect of the sadhana everything.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I think it's a unique in the fact that it's sort of a practice for death throughout the waking state, throughout the sleeping state, and then of
but
course when
but
death
yeah,
comes, or at least you're
it,
always reminded of that process.
yeah, absolutely. But
Whereas
I
in
would
a lot of
also,
traditions, I mean, it's like death is coming someday, whereas it seems like there's a constant. I mean, it's not an escapist thing that's coming later, so to speak. Do you see what I'm saying?
yeah, I mean, you're
Mhm.
trying to affect a death, prior to the actual death. And that's what that going into that emptiness state in meditation is.
Mhm.
It is the dissolution.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
absolutely. But I would also say, like, it's a joyful practice, and it brings about joy and states of bliss and wonderment. And so it in some ways it might seem counterintuitive or paradoxical to, like, be practicing for death but then being joyful and happy and all the time. But it's just how it works. I don't know. I mean, I don't understand it. It's just how it is.
Right, right, right. That's pretty funny. Um, I was having a conversation maybe yesterday or something, and the only way I can describe like these practices, the emptiness. So one can say, yeah, but is this like a null? Is this sort of like zoning out? Well, I feel empty when I'm, eating Cheetos and spacing out watching Netflix, right? But I think
No,
that
it
I think there's a
it can't be
characteristic of
that.
like dullness versus sort of a heightened, a bliss and a heightened sense of awareness, I guess you would say.
I don't know. I mean, for me,
Hmm.
emptiness, that's I don't know. That there's no person that can have the experience of emptiness, because emptiness is empty.
Right,
It's
right,
even empty of emptiness. So
right, right.
and there can't be a Greg who's, like, knowing the emptiness,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Because it's empty.
Right,
It's
right, right.
There's no things.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there's no thought, there's no identity, there's no time or space or location, or there's nothing. But yet, like I said, it's openness, in the sense that there is the potential for all that does arise in appearance.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think one approach too is that they, at least in the tradition we're talking about, they almost emphasize like the use of desire or bliss
Oh
towards
yeah,
the recognition of emptiness rather than the denial of it, right? It's sort of a vehicle, I guess you would say. It can be a vehicle.
definitely.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yo, it definitely is. I mean, that is the main point of these practices, is they bring about intense states of bliss,
Hmm.
and what I would call, like, a Gnostic intoxication.
Hmm.
And that is not the goal of the practice. That is it's a method
Hmm.
that you then, like, bathe the body mind in this nectar of bliss over and over and over again. And you may ask yourself, well, what's the point of this? It seems hedonistic and indulgent. Well, if the bliss and the Gnostic intoxication was the goal, then it would be. But that's not the goal.
Hmm.
We take There's a line in one of the sadhanas. It says, the sole remedy for being's suffering is bliss.
Hmm. That's good. I like
And
that.
that's it. And so the sole remedy for being suffering is bliss. And so we cultivate bliss through spiritual practice as a way to know joy and happiness, and the fact that one can feel good
Hmm.
literally for no reason at all,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
other than they're feeling devotion and longing for the divine.
Right. Definitely. Yeah, some of the sadhanas or liturgies are quite beautiful too. Like I ask for a rainfall of transforming and blessing energies, and some of it just is very beautiful to even read, even if you're even almost
Oh
from a
yeah.
literary perspective, not even necessarily from actually experiencing it too, right?
No, it's completely sublime. I mean,
Right.
it would, and this is how these practicing these sadhanas is able to literally change one's state of being by doing it.
Hmm.
And it has that power. What is they say the words of enlightened being are not just speech. They have spiritual power, and it's
Hmm.
true.
Hmm. To kind of backtrack a little bit, you talked a little bit about like guru yoga and like Vajrasattva. So some of these practices um, almost involve like melting the guru or the deity into yourself, right? So maybe you can explain a little bit. Do you see a huge difference, or do you see any similarities between like Western esoteric practices of invocation? This is actually a listener question, by the way. Is there a big difference between like Western practices of invocation versus these Vajrayana practices of kind of, it could be guru yoga or working with deities?
I think there's significant differences.
Hmm.
One is again like being empowered by the lineage holder to do the practice, and so there are changes to the practitioner's subtle body as a result of the empowerment initiation, as well as a result of doing the practice itself after having received that initiation. So that's a significant difference. Um, I think the other difference is like just in terms of like what traditions are being worked with, because some traditions are living, like certainly Vajrayana is a living tradition with in living enlightened teachers and uh, practitioners doing intense practice every day, devotional offerings, and like a wide array of activities to support this. But other traditions are not really still living, and
Hmm.
yet people will work, and I use that term delicately, with deities from these traditions that you know they might be practiced in a marginal sense, or they might not be practiced at all, depending on what we're talking about, because
Hmm.
people could be invoking like Sumerian deities. Well, that
Hmm.
tradition's been dead for thousands of years.
Mm.
The Egyptian tradition, well, like there might be like reconstructionist or revivalist movements, but do we even know how they really practiced it? I I,
Mhm.
I don't.
Mhm.
Uh, Greek traditions, like certainly Greece has been a Christian country for a very long time.
Mhm.
So like you can't really envision these deities as having the same vitality at this point. And I don't mean to make this into like some sort of crude analysis on different deities from different traditions, comparing and contrasting.
Mhm.
I'm just trying to express the idea that um, not all traditions have the same level of current devotion and practice. And so if you're working within one that is like tremendously alive, and to me that the difference is palpable. I mean, I've done both, and the
Mhm.
difference is for me very palpable. And I would never say to anyone to not do what you're doing, or that it's somehow not correct or that it's wrong. That's not it. That's not it at all. It's really just a recognition of sort of the context of one's spiritual practice.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have a another listener question as well. What do you think about people who mix traditions? For example, mixing, I don't know, Golden Dawn rituals with Buddhism, or mixing sort of
Did you just
religious
make that
magical.
up?
No,
Does
somebody.
anybody, is anybody really doing that?
I don't know. Somebody sent me that. So, I mean, do you think that? I mean, I obviously you said you're not going to say, what someone's doing is wrong, but would you say that? I doubt that you'd recommend doing that, but
Here's what I would say.
you know,
If you're just starting out, if you
mhm,
are new to spiritual practice,
mhm,
you should definitely not be mixing traditions and practices at your whim, like it's some sort of spiritual smorgasbord.
mhm,
That's insulting, I think, to people who are really devoted to these traditions. However, if you've been on the spiritual path for a while and you've done different paths and are familiar with different traditions, and maybe you've had some level of accomplishment in them, if you want to mix and match stuff at that point, like, who the fuck is going to tell you not to? I'm sorry, maybe I
right.
shouldn't be speaking this way on your podcast.
No. I like it.
I'm a coarse man. I'm sorry.
No, I like it. I like it. Yeah,
But
yeah. Uh-huh.
but really, like, at that point, like, who the gives a shit? Like, do what you want. Like, you've earned it.
Right.
And here's another thing, like you already mentioned in your question about Vajrayana and magic and shamanism, and like, what spiritual tradition isn't syncretic,
Hmm.
right? I mean, they
Hmm.
all are. I mean, if a spiritual tradition is really effective, they're going to take anything that works and adapt it to their own use. I mean,
Hmm.
Christian esotericism, for crying out loud, is resting on a basis of Jewish Kabbalism. So, you know, I'd say I don't always really advocate just doing whatever you want, certainly. And I'll continue to call it a spiritual smorgasbord. I think, honestly, like, syncretism in that's done well is more beneficial and
Hmm.
helps people ultimately, I think.
Hmm. Okay. I mentioned earlier, I believe in the podcast, or maybe before we started recording, that I just picked up your book, PRONAOS: Reflections on the Preliminary Practices of Buddhist Tantra from a Western Perspective. Maybe you can share a little bit about the book, what inspired you to write it, and in general, who is this book written for? What kind of person should pick this up?
So the book is really written for people who are interested in Buddhist Tantra, but they're not interested in Asian culture, or sort of like diving into it from the Tibetan cultural perspective,
Hmm.
in terms of reading books written by Tibetan teachers. Now, there's nothing wrong with those books. And on some level, if one is an advanced practitioner, they're going to have to read them and, you know, derive some benefit from them. But as a Westerner who's familiar with Western esotericism and Western philosophy, I felt that I was at least able to convey the essential elements of the view and the practices and the result well enough that it would be beneficial and maybe could reach people who might be interested but were sort of didn't have a good introduction to it, to really get an understanding of what it was, why one might be interested in it, what the benefits were, all of these things. So that's who I'm addressing is Westerners, Western esoteric practitioners who might be looking for a spiritual path that could actually deliver the goods on Gnosis.
Okay, great.
And
Mm-hmm.
so the reason I wrote it is my teacher asked me to write it after I finished Nongdro, because he's a Westerner and he teaches Westerners, and in order to be able to reach Westerners, he has to, I think, at least approach them on the level, where they're at. I mean, certainly there are Westerners who are already interested in Buddhism, but this is a very esoteric path. So, maybe it would be good to get people who are already interested in esotericism and have some level of experience and understanding with that. And so that's, I think, kind of what we're aiming towards. And I think the book is pretty effective at conveying it. I mean, you'll have to be the judge when you read it, but
Right. Yeah, it sounds very interesting, and I kind of glanced through it last night, and I plan to start it today. But I did notice the reviews are incredible. I bought it through Amazon Kindle, and I was just browsing through the reviews, and they were all like 5 stars. Everybody's very enthusiastic about it, and I think that a lot of people did kind of relate that it made it relatable using sort of different examples that and quotes that Westerners can relate with, right?
yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I again, there's nothing against the books written by Tibetans about their own tradition. They do it very well, but they do it in a style that is very impersonal for the most part,
Mm-hmm.
and doesn't speak to Western philosophy or use Western examples to illustrate the points.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the other part of what I'm trying to do with this book is express that on some level, Gnosis is not divided by East and West. There's Gnosis in all authentic religious traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is a delicate point, because when I say that, I'm excluding, Freemasonry, ceremonial magic, tarot, alchemy, what have you, from this, because there's not Gnosis in those traditions, despite my desire for there to be.
Okay. Are there any, so you did mention earlier that you are working on a new book. Is that coming out soon? Is there a timeline for that if people want to check it out?
Yeah, so the book is coming out through Anathema Publishing Limited. It's I apologize, I don't have it in front of me, but the title is I'm blanking on the title, but it involves Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, his Kabbalah, his angelology, and this idea of Gnosis, and sort of his quest for the perennial philosophy. And it should be coming out probably sometime in the fall.
Okay.
But if you check the Anathema Publishing website, they'll have updates. And I think it's going to be open for pre-order very soon, if it's not already.
Okay, that sounds
And
great.
I should tell you also, this book is based on my thesis for my degree in medieval studies at Harvard, and I got a lot of great feedback on it, and I think it's definitely worthy of reading if you're interested in the Western esoteric tradition, if you're interested in Christian Kabbalah, if you're interested in angels, if you're interested in the way that a Jewish esoteric tradition was adapted by Christian philosophers in a very beautiful but bizarre sort of act of appropriation.
That sounds very interesting, and
It's
obviously very well
hugely
researched.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, I spent years researching this, and I got a lot of help from my thesis advisor, Dr. Kimberly Patton at the Harvard Divinity School. And it's just it was quite an experience, a real revelation to read to be able to write this and research it.
Okay, yeah, your book sounds really interesting. I really look forward to checking it out. And I know I'll get a notification about it through Foolish Fish, who seems to find out when everything's coming out. Exactly. So,
well, that would be great. I hope he does.
Yeah, hopefully he'll feature it on there, huh? But yeah, I think this has been a really great conversation, and it was a really pleasure talking with you. Where can people find you? We mentioned you have your podcast, and maybe you can share with the listeners about your podcast, websites, or any way that they can correspond with you or find you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, occultofpersonality.net or Occult of Personality, wherever you get your podcasts. We also have our membership section at chamberofreflection.com. And my email, if anyone wants to get in touch with me, is brothergreg@protonmail.com. I'm also on Twitter, Occult of Personality, and Facebook and Instagram. But email's probably the easiest if anybody actually wants to get in touch and ask any questions or what have you. So I really enjoyed talking with you, Ryan, and I apologize it was so difficult to get together, but I'm glad we finally did, because it was really great to talk with you, and I look forward to hearing this when it comes out.
Yeah, definitely. I'll include all the links that you mentioned in the show notes. And yeah, maybe when your next book is getting close to coming out, maybe we can have you on again if you're up for it to discuss a bit about that too. That'd be great.
Yeah, cool. I'd love to. That's a whole different topic, but ultimately leads to Gnosis too. So it's very, very interesting historically. So I'd love to talk to you about it.
Yeah, that'd be great. It'd be a good contrast with this one as well. Okay,
sure.
Cool. All right. So thanks for coming on, and until next time.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
All right, cool. Take it easy. Have a good night too.